Hey everyone, it's John here from NHL Hockey to talk about an interesting subject. So I'm going to go over the top 10 NHL players that never played for the team that drafted them. So I'll go over 10 players and go over some detail, but I'm just going to give you a few examples to give you some context. So a guy like Jack Johnson, who was drafted high by the Carolina Hurricanes. After a few attempts to get an entry-level deal, it just didn't work out. He was then traded to the LA Kings, of course traded to the Columbus Blue Jackets, and now he's a Pittsburgh Penguin today. So he never played for the Carolina Hurricanes, the team that drafted him. Frederik Andersen, another one related to the Hurricanes. So Freddie Andersen, drafted in the 2010 NHL entry draft, 7th round. The contract couldn't come together, and then he re-entered the draft in 2012 and was drafted in the 3rd round by the Anaheim Ducks. Of course, played for the Anaheim Ducks, and then now he's a Leaf after being traded. So just another example related to the Hurricanes, but and that one's different. That's why I didn't have him in the top 10. I mean, he still has a ways to go in his career as well. But he kind of did play for the team that drafted him, just not the original team that drafted him. So the Anaheim Ducks drafted him 2nd, and then he ended up playing for the Ducks. So that's just another example there. And then Justin Schultz and Jake Gardiner, both from the Anaheim Ducks. Jake Gardiner was traded with Lupul to the Leafs in exchange for Beauchemin, so a prospect just being traded, versus Justin Schultz, who just didn't sign an entry-level deal. Then when he was able to, sign with the Edmonton Oilers and then traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins. So that's just another couple of examples of players that didn't play for the team that drafted them. So let's get into the top 10 list. If you are here to show some support to the channel, please subscribe, hit that like button, and comment your thoughts. And let's start off with number 10, Ryan McDonagh. So McDonagh, this is an interesting one. He was drafted to the Montreal Canadiens, and for the Canadiens and the fans, I mean, this is one of the most lopsided deals. And at the time, McDonagh was just a prospect. They didn't really know what they had completely. If he'd be that top 4 defenseman, if he'd be a top 2 defenseman. And Scott Gomez, who was 30 at the time, up until that point, was having a great career. And it's not like he had this complete drop-off, but he was not the player that they thought they were acquiring, at least. And he was getting older. So McDonagh, he was drafted in the 2007 NHL entry draft and then traded in a package which ended up being for Gomez in the 2009 year. So I think if you're looking at what McDonagh became and versus what Gomez was at the time, the Montreal Canadiens were kind of going through somewhat of a transition. They got Camilleri, they had Giunta, they were trying to hold on to being a Canadian team, whether it was for their fans or for their organization. At the time, they probably should have retooled, and if you talk to a lot of Canadiens fans, they should have went into a different direction, but they were trading younger pieces to hold on to experienced veterans, and it just didn't work out for them. And McDonagh was one of the victims of that. He was traded and ended up having a great playing career with the New York Rangers and still career with the Tampa Bay Lightning as he was traded. So Ryan McDonagh ended up being that top 2 defenseman for the Rangers. He was that solid 2-way guy. He played for the U.S. in the Olympics. So that looks like a horrible trade for the Montreal Canadiens. McDonagh could still be playing for them today. It was a horrible deal. And Ryan McDonagh did not play for the Montreal Canadiens, the team that drafted him. Okay, so this is an interesting one. First row, right in the middle of those 2 guys, Brian Berard, Wade Redden. That's the 1st and 2nd overall pick of the 95 draft. So Brian Berard was drafted 1st overall by the Ottawa Senators, and Wade Redden was drafted 2nd overall by the New York Islanders. You also see Shane Doan there on top left. The overall story here is Brian Berard, who was drafted 1st overall. He looked at that organization. It was a fairly new organization to the league. 2 years prior, they drafted Alexander Daigle. That ended up being one of the biggest busts in NHL history, a huge bust. And if you're looking at Brian Berard, he just didn't have the trust in the organization. And once the preseason got underway and he didn't make the team, as an 18-year-old, he requested a trade. So after all of his kind of doubts about the organization, he still tried to make the team. He didn't after believing he should have, and then he requested a trade. By January, he was traded for the player that was drafted after him, which was Wade Redden's 2nd overall. So Wade Redden ended up playing over 1,000 games and just a star, a legend in Ottawa. Where Brian Berard was traded from the New York Islanders. He played well, but he was traded from the Islanders to the Leafs in exchange for Felix Potvin. So Potvin, the Islanders thought they needed some help at the time in net, and Brian Berard traded with the Leafs. Of course, Berard had that insane injury that didn't necessarily end his career, but definitely gave huge fallback to it. And at the time, you can't really say that there was the huge winner because Brian Berard was first overall, Wade Redden was second overall, and they both had great starts to their career. But overall, you're seeing what Wade Redden did. It's interesting to see what would have happened and if that would have affected different people's careers. But overall, both these players, Brian Berard, Wade Redden, did not play for the teams that drafted them. Brian Berard never played for the Ottawa Senators. Wade Redden never played for the New York Islanders. And both players' careers were changed for the future. So I think that's, just right there, you see the picture. That was their draft day. Brian Berard, number 1. Wade Redden, number 2. All right, so Kimmo Timonen. This one is another great story. Timonen, he played for 3 NHL teams. He was drafted in the 10th round pick of the LA Kings in 1993. So he came out of nowhere. He ended up playing 1,100 games. Like I said, only 3 teams. And the LA Kings held his rights for about 5 years. He didn't come over to North America. And then finally, when he was traded from the LA Kings to the Nashville Predators, he opted to come to North America, play, and obviously, a lot of people would kind of say Timonen was recognized for his time with the Flyers, but his time in the NHL and where he was started with the Nashville Predators. And then, of course, he was traded to the Flyers and then finished his career with the Chicago Blackhawks, where he won the Stanley Cup. Besides that, he ended up being the 7th highest scoring Finnish player in history and the 2nd highest scoring Finnish defender. So Timonen, he has that legacy and he has that resume. And yes, he was a steal by the LA Kings and he came out of nowhere, but he never played for the LA Kings, the team that drafted him. All right, so Philip Forsberg, this, I would say definitely for the Washington Capitals, this is the most lopsided deal ever. Contending team, a team that was confident going towards the trade deadline, towards the playoffs, and they traded Philip Forsberg, their 11th overall pick from 2012, who actually dropped. He was projected to be a top 5 pick, and then because of, the question marks, was he going to play in North America? There was just a whole bunch of question marks around him, and he dropped to 11th overall, and a lot of people thought the Capitals could have got a steal there with Philip Forsberg, and they didn't know what they had yet. They traded him early as a prospect for Martin Erat, and Martin Erat ended up being a bust. I don't even think he played 100 games. He played less than 100 games with the team. He was around 30 years of age at the time, and Philip Forsberg, we all know, ended up becoming a star. He's a star for the Nashville Predators, and yes, the Capitals in that time have won a Stanley Cup, the Predators have not, but overall, it's still a horrible deal by the Capitals, and Philip Forsberg never got to play for the team that drafted him. All right, so Blake Wheeler. So this one is a crazy one. Blake Wheeler was the Phoenix Coyotes' 5th overall selection in the 2004 NHL entry draft. And after not wanting to sign an entry-level deal, he became a UFA eventually and signed his first NHL deal with the Boston Bruins. And of course, Blake Wheeler played for the Boston Bruins, and then they kind of traded him too soon. And Blake Wheeler was kind of a late bloomer because the Boston Bruins traded him to the Atlantic Thrashers, and then obviously the Thrashers became the Winnipeg Jets, and now you're seeing Blake Wheeler with the Winnipeg Jets. He's a star, he's their captain, and so by fault by the Boston Bruins, but the Arizona Coyotes were the first victim that weren't able to sign Blake Wheeler in such a high draft spot. You're talking about a 5th overall pick. We kind of see, the big one, there's been a couple over the years, but a guy like Jimmy Vesey, the Nashville Predators wanted to sign him under contract. It just didn't work out. But then you're kind of looking at a guy like Blake Wheeler. That was 5th overall. 5th overall. So that's definitely a high one to let go. Didn't sign that contract. Sign with the Boston Bruins, and then you know the rest. So Blake Wheeler never played for the Arizona Coyotes, the team that drafted him. All right, so Tuukka Rask and Andrew Raycroft. Bruins fans know this one well. Leafs fans know this one well. Insane. I think just kind of to sum it up, Tuukka Rask, a Stanley Cup champion. He's the starting goaltender for the Boston Bruins. He's the top 10 goalie in the league right now. Rewind to, how it happened. So Rask was drafted by the Toronto Maple Leafs, 21st overall in the 2005 draft. His rights were traded for Andrew Raycroft, and the Leafs at the time needed goaltending help, and they thought Raycroft was that, but Raycroft at most was a mediocre goalie, and Tuukka Rask was the first goalie to be drafted in that draft. So they thought they had their future guy in Justin Pogge. Justin Pogge became nothing, so that kind of makes the Leafs look even worse in that situation. And they treated the guy that ended up being the star, ended up being the number 1 guy. So Justin Pogge was a guy the Bruins would have took for Andrew Raycroft, and the Leafs opted to keep him and offer Rask instead. Ridiculous timing, ridiculous trade for the Leafs, and it goes down as one of the worst trades in Leafs history. And the Boston Bruins get to laugh not only after they have beaten the Leafs in the first round, but that their number one goalie, their goalie that's stopping them, is a guy they traded away for a bum. Tim Thomas, another Boston Bruin, and this one's another interesting story. He was drafted by the Quebec Nordiques, and the Nordiques were kind of infamous for having players, whether it was early on, right when they were drafted, or just a few years in, players that just didn't end up being happy with the organization. And that's kind of what happened. Tim Thomas, drafted in the 1994 NHL entry draft, and didn't play his first NHL games until I think like the early 2000s. I think it was 2002. 8 years, which is insane. So Tim Thomas ended up being a Stanley Cup champion, Conn Smythe winner, and it ends up going down as, like, again, with the Quebec Nordiques. We'll talk about another guy on this list, but for Tim Thomas, the goalie he became, yes, he was a very big late bloomer, but the patience there and just kind of his path and his journey, and that was a big storyline around Tim Thomas. And like I said, played only 8 years later, and then of course his career took off. But with the Quebec Nordiques, it was just a slow start after the 1994 draft, and he never played for that team. All right, so Eric Lindros, this is another one related to the Quebec Nordiques. So Eric Lindros was coined the next one. He was the next big thing. And he was 17 years old. He was tearing up the OHL with the Generals. And the Nordiques drafted him with the first overall pick in the 1991 draft. And that was a no-doubter. They picked Eric Lindros. It wasn't a question mark for them. But right off the bat, he refused to don the jersey. And it started a year-long standoff between him and the team. Finally, he was dealt to the Flyers for, I mean, what they said was a king's ransom, with Peter Forsberg going the other way. So that's one of the crazier, I mean, the last few decades, that's one of the crazier deals we've seen. I mean, a first overall pick. I mean, another one that just comes to mind is with the Toronto Maple Leafs. We saw Matt Sundin, which was one of the best prospects in the game, traded for Wendell Clark. Like, that's another huge one. Like, you could talk about huge deals over the last few decades. Like, this one was a big deal. This one was insane. So, yes, at the time, I think both teams were happy with what they were getting. But, of course, Lindros, concussions cut his career short. And it affected his elite talent. But regardless, he was later inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So, I mean, at the end of the day, Eric Lindros, he never played for the Quebec Nordiques, and he was that Hall of Fame guy. All right, Jarome Iginla. So I have Jarome Iginla at number 1. I honestly don't think enough people realize how good Iginla was. And Iginla was actually drafted by the Dallas Stars. So the Dallas Stars dealt their first round draft pick from 95 to Calgary for Joe Nieuwendyk. And Nieuwendyk ended up being a key member of the Dallas Stars, late 90s, early 2000s, championship in 99, Conn Smythe winning, all that. Great. But Calgary did not lose that trade. They got Jarome Iginla. They got their franchise player. They got their future captain. And at the end of the day, this one is interesting because, again, it was a huge deal, and both teams got a huge piece in this trade. Like I said, the Stars with Nieuwendyk. But the Flames with Iginla, yes, there was no Stanley Cup to show for, but Iginla ended up being that guy for Calgary, ended up being the face of the franchise, and the amount of games he played with the Calgary Flames up until, of course, he was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then played with the Boston Bruins, Colorado Avalanche. So he had this long career, and then at the end, of course, the trades. But he was that player for the Calgary Flames, the way Matt Sundin was for the Toronto Maple Leafs, the way Saku Koivu or Kovalev was for the Montreal Canadiens, whoever you want to say it, Ottawa Senators, Daniel Alfredson. Jarome Iginla was that for the Calgary Flames. I could even throw out some more. The Sedins, the Vancouver Canucks. So I think this one is crazy. It wasn't the Dallas Stars losing out in a big way because they got Nieuwendyk, but it is a big in the sense that they traded away Jarome Iginla. So thank you for watching. I think this was an interesting video to make, and you know what, I did organize it, but it's a lot of information to kind of take in. It easily can become a longer video, if I go through them slowly, but I tried to kind of compact the information and give you all the summary of what went down. So these were the top 10. I gave you some honorable mentions, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. A little bit of a different video from what I do, but I hope to do more videos like this in the future. So definitely subscribe if you would like, hit that thumbs up, and comment your thoughts. So I hope to see you all soon. This was John from Hot Take Hockey. Have a good one. Peace out.